So during the first couple of weeks, our focus has been really on structure of getting the main structural components together in the speech. Now that you've done that, we're turning to the next part, which is what you're putting into your speech. And this is called supporting material. We've already looked at one type of supporting material in your believe it or not speeches, which are stories. So one thing I can tell you moving forward from that is it's best to have a variety of supporting material for your audience. It's good for you, it's good for them. Rather than hearing all statistics or all stories, having variety is great. Kind of like with your favorite snack. You don't want to always eat the same kind of chips or the same kind of chocolate, though I wouldn't mind the same kind of chocolate. But generally, variety is really wonderful for both you and also your audience. So the four most common types of supporting material, realize that there are more than four, but each of those, first one which you've already covered is stories. And stories really are divided up into two main categories, one being a real story, and this can either happen to you or it can happen to someone else, or you maybe looked it up on a website and you found a story of somebody. That's also a real story. A hypothetical story, as an opposite, is a story that you make up for the purpose of your speech. So it's not really a story that's been found, but you craft it because you want to try to make a point, and the story will certainly do that. The second kind of supporting material are statistics. So statistics refers to both raw numbers and percentages. So the raw number would be, 3 million or 200,000 or 24 out of 30 would all be raw numbers. The percentage would be what it sounds like. It would be the percentage. This morning I heard a speech that, 86% of high school students procrastinate. By the time they get to college, that number goes up to 88%. That would be a statistic. The third type of supporting material, which is very common in speeches, is what is called testimony. Testimony, by definition, is simply the opinion of other people. So your own opinion doesn't count as testimony. It would be something that someone else tells you. And there's two types of testimony. There's what's called lay testimony. I think your book uses terms like peer testimony or maybe even hearsay testimony, but peer testimony is one that they use. Lay testimony is simply testimony by a non-expert. And then the opposite then is expert testimony, which is the opinions of someone who is an expertise in that particular field. So we could go into more detail here, and we can, about what's the distinction between lay testimony and expert testimony. So certainly lay testimony would be anything that you would see on a Yelp review. That would be lay testimony. See the opinions of people who are not experts in the field. You don't have restaurant reviewers leaving a review on Yelp. It's your friend or your neighbor leaving a review. So those would be most commonly lay testimony. One that you would go to probably quite a bit would be, and you probably did before this semester, is ratemyprofessor.com. This is not my own review, but I found it and thought it was just so awful I had to include it. As the student wrote, I never wore a seatbelt while driving to school because I wanted to die before making it to his class. So not very helpful, but certainly passionate. But this would also be an example of lay testimony. It might be that you have someone who has, so an example of expert testimony in this particular example would be a student who is, say, a biology major. And let's say that their review started by saying, I'm a biology major, I've taken 7 different biology classes, and this particular instructor is one that I really enjoyed, all right, and this is why I enjoyed them. Here's why they're a good teacher. That's now lay testimony that's kind of approaching expert testimony. In other words, that person has had a significant amount of experience in that, and so maybe they're able to provide a better review. Usually when we talk about experts, and if you think for a minute about people in your life that you consider experts, it might be life experience, maybe grandma, grandpa, you consider very wise and experts in life because they've lived a long time. The doctor that you go see for whatever condition you have, that would be an expert in their field. If someone has a hobby and they've been doing it for a while, let's say they've been paintballing for a while, then you might consider them an expert. If someone, and this is usually a comment that comes up in class, if someone knows more than me, in other words, if you look at someone and say, you know more than this topic than I do, I'm going to consider you an expert here. That may also be what an expert would be. So expertise usually involves work experience. It usually involves some kind of advanced degree. If it's an academic degree, it might be certification or a certification. So the person who cuts your hair, for example, has that little certificate, placed at their station so that you can see that they've actually been through training. So that may be expert testimony. Again, if someone knows more than you, that may be expert testimony. If someone is recognized by other experts in the field as being an expert, then that would be considered expert testimony. And really, there's a hierarchy in all of these. So if we look at something like Amazon, for example, you can find a whole bunch of lay testimony in Amazon if you're looking for a particular item. You can also find reviews from experts. So if it's a power tool you're looking at and you go to the reviews, you're going to find at least one, if not many, reviews that start with, I've been a contractor for 25 years, or I've been a carpenter for 30 years, and this is the best power tool. So that would be an expert. So the thing to know with both lay testimony and expert testimony is there's always a hierarchy. So there's always, the lay testimony that you probably would kind of overlook, like the rate by professor one here. And you might go to another one that might be more persuasive. You might do the same with a Yelp review. You look at one and you go, yeah, I don't really trust that, but this one seems like they sort of know what they're talking about. So there are levels of expertise in both lay testimony and expert testimony. That would be the thing I would want to tell you. So do they always have to be a doctor? No, Dr. Phil, they don't always have to be a doctor in order to be an expert. Thank you for showing up. So that is a little bit more about both lay testimony and expert testimony. Again, those are opinions of other people. So we've looked now at both stories, we've looked at statistics, both raw numbers and percentages. We've also looked at testimony, both lay and expert testimony. We're up to the final and fourth, and again, there are more types of supporting material than just these four, but the one for our purposes today is studies. So a study, I have kind of a visual aid of something very sciencey. It doesn't have to be sciencey. A study simply starts with a question that needs to be answered, and some researcher is going to answer that. So it might be, gee, I wonder how common is it that high school students procrastinate? And then they go out and they interview a bunch of high school students and they find out that about 86% of high school students procrastinate. And that is from what I at least heard this morning. So that would be an example of a study, and then that information gets published. Most topics have some studies behind them. Usage of cell phones while driving, now a whole bunch of studies, those came out years and years ago. The effect of secondhand smoke on people. That would have been one that came out a long time ago. Anything regarding COVID has studies behind it now, which get published, and then they get sent out, and everybody then learns new information about COVID. So that's the route that stories take, is they end up being published, and they are fairly conclusive. Of all the types of supporting material, studies would be the most conclusive. So there you have it in a nutshell. So we've got stories, statistics, testimony, and studies. Like I said, there are more. I'm going to keep saying that because there are more. These are just the ones that I think are most common and I usually hear in speeches. So with that, have fun putting your speech together.